The modern history of Korea begins in 1897. Korea had been a tributary of the Qing dynasty of China since the year 1636. And by the late 19th century, China's influence over Korea was at an all-time low. In October of 1897, King Gojong yielded to rising pressure from the public and proclaimed that Korea was now an independent state, which would be known as the Great Korean Empire. And Gojong now became the Emperor of Korea. The first 7 years of the empire were peaceful and were making great strides to becoming a modern nation. But by 1900, there was another industrializing Asian power, the Empire of Japan. In 1904, war had been declared between the Japanese Empire and the Russian Empire. This is known as the Russo-Japanese War. Korea tried to remain neutral during the conflict, but after much Japanese pressure, Korea signed an agreement with Japan that allowed Japanese armies to travel through its territory. And in 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed, and Japan was the victor of the war. With Japanese forces already on the Korean Peninsula, Japan annexed Korea in 1910. For the next 3 decades, the Koreans were occupied by the Japanese. At the minimum, Japan was trying to wipe out Korean culture and language, forcing Koreans to accept Japanese dominance and having school taught in Japanese only. At the maximum, Japanese soldiers would rape and murder thousands of Koreans. Because of the brutal Japanese oppression, the Koreans and Japanese still remain enemies to this day. The largest humanitarian crisis had begun around the world beginning in 1939, the Second World War. The war in the Pacific was a brutal slaughter. By August 1945, the war was all but over. The United States and the Soviet Union agreed in July of 1945 that Korean independence would be guaranteed following World War II. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union invaded the northern provinces of Korea, but by September 2, 1945, Japan had surrendered to the Allied powers. So on September 8, 1945, the United States landed troops in the southern provinces of Korea to secure southern Korea from the remaining Japanese forces. The Soviet Union and the United States would divide the Koreans along the 38th parallel. The plan was to unite Korea after a few years, but in the few years that the United States and the Soviet Union occupied Korea, they'd already established their ideologies among the people. In the American-occupied provinces, democracy was established. On August 15, 1947, the Americans helped to establish the Republic of Korea, or as it is known today, South Korea. The first president was elected, known as Syngman Rhee. In the Soviet-occupied provinces, communism was the established ideology. On September 8, 1947, Soviet Union allowed for the establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or as it is known as today, North Korea. North Korea was led by a pro-communist man by the name of Kim Il-sung, and the government allowed for a new dynasty to be created, the Kim dynasty. Both Koreas wanted one united Korea, but specifically under their government. Soviet and American occupation ended in 1948, and both Koreas began constructing their own armies. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung began negotiating with the Soviet Union about reunifying the peninsula by force. The Soviets agreed to send support, and on June 25, 1950, North Korea began total invasion of the South. The South was completely unprepared, and after 10 days, they were pushed back to the port city of Busan. The North Koreans took a large gamble that the United States would not care about the invasion, but the United States cared a lot.
We know that the cost of freedom is high, but we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost.
The UN Security Council voted on June 26 that this invasion was an act of aggression, and American troops began landing on July 4, 1950. World War II General Douglas MacArthur was appointed as the head commander for UN troops in Korea. UN and American forces held the Busan perimeter for 2 months, but on September 25, 1950, MacArthur counterattacked. American troops amphibiously invaded the city of Incheon and cut off North Korean troops from their supply chains. In a matter of a few days, the war had completely turned around. American, South Korean, and UN troops pushed past the 38th parallel and captured the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, on the 19th of October. The Korean War was over. North Korea had completely collapsed, and victory seemed only days away. However, the recently turned communist nation, China, was being frightened by South Korea's victory. If American troops destroyed North Korea, they may not stop and continue advancing into communist China. On October 19, Chinese troops crossed the border of North Korea, and their first offensive with American troops began on the 25th. UN troops fought back, but human waves of Chinese would cross this new no-man's land, and bodies would begin piling on top of each other on the ground. The Chinese would overrun UN troops, and so the mass wave tactics pushed UN troops back to Seoul. MacArthur had had enough. In December of 1950, General Douglas MacArthur asked for presidential approval for dropping nuclear weapons on the Chinese-Korean border. Truman and MacArthur fought violently over this action, but ultimately, Truman fired MacArthur during the spring of 1951. The situation had only gotten worse. UN troops were now pushed past Seoul once again. But now that spring had come, the Americans pushed back. UN forces pushed past the 38th parallel, until finally, a stalemate arose. After 2 more years of stalemate, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, and the modern borders between North and South Korea were established. For many years, both of the Koreas were undesirable places, but ironically, North Korea was safer and had a much more stable economy than South Korea. This lasted for nearly 3 decades. South Korea underwent 6 periods of unrest, and during this time, there were 6 different constitutional republics. But in the 1980s, the two nations swapped. South Korea opened up to more democratic elections, and the economy boomed. In North Korea, fear of a continuation of the Korean War turned North Korea into a militaristic state, focusing mainly on self-defense, nuclear threats, and glory to the Kim dynasty. Both sides to this day still fear the Korean War. Because an armistice was signed, the Korean War is technically an ongoing war that can begin again at any second. However, in recent years, North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in have expressed interest in an end to the conflict, so that maybe one day peace can return to the peninsula.